So the motivations, we could group them basically. There were lots of responses, of course, but the motivations primarily fell under there's a story to tell that has been largely untold, so it was correcting that imbalance, basically. So it was to get word out about a contribution that was underrepresented, and that's the simplest way to put it, really. And, to engage groups that hadn't been engaged before, that were underrepresented within sort of the heritage sector or within the whole sort of World War I contributions agenda, really. So there were a lot of young people or poor people or, you know, from the diverse groups as well. So the motivation there was to engage people that hadn't been brought into the picture.
The stories that were being told are exciting, they're untold, they're stories that are right under our noses. So there was a strong motivation to just sort of overthrow a mainstream or an entitled view of the history of World War I, that it's a chap in puttees and a tin hat heading off to northern France, and to talk about the different. We've got women campaigning for peace from all over the world, apart from the Australians who were late because their boat was late. And we've got the Black British experience as well as the Black Caribbean experience, because, you know, we've got docks in Cardiff, you've got docks all around the countryside where there are mixed communities. So that was very important. Another element, a motivation, because we've got an archivist at the table, which is always good, is the stuff. We've got the stuff and no one knows about it. It's rare, it's special. The tribunal papers in Staffordshire, there's only 2 collections of those in the country that go into such detail. So the stories that are coming out of those, she's gone from 6 volunteers to 50 since November. Aren't you impressed? I'm impressed. So there's this huge motivation to share stuff, really.
Well, actually, our experience was pretty similar to those two that have just been outlined. There's this sense that the history is hidden, or it's if it's known, it's not known by necessarily the right people, or not necessarily known in sufficient detail or in sufficient number. And there's this real motivation on the part of groups, both in the wider community and in academia, that this needs to be corrected and that the centenary is the opportunity to do that. Quite a common theme was people's own individual family histories, that the people leading these projects, involved in these projects, have got direct family experience, and that's motivated it, and that it's key to people's identity, whether it as an individual or as a member of a particular population, or whether it's or any kind of identifying factor, that the war is integral to that, and that people want to share that and want to explore it more, and to give other people the tools to do it for themselves.
A big factor here, unearthing those hidden histories, those that research with no track record previously. In addition to that, we've got the utilisation of resources and getting people into the archives that wouldn't normally go into the museums and archives.
Quite a few people talked about meaning making, telling a story in a way that resonates with the current contemporary community, trying to catch the imagination of members in a particular group. Concerns about little grandchildren not understanding anything about the First World War and wanting to bring it alive for them. Something about also wanting to correct history. There were stories that needed to be filled out, there was data that needed to be interrogated better to give a more accurate, honest account. And somebody very bravely said, it's my job, so I want to do it as best as I can.
For one group, they were interested in engaging with the rural poor. They said that in all their activity it was clear that they weren't necessarily getting out to those groups, and that also then brought about discussions about engaging the urban poor. So there was a class dimension to this that was brought out, which is that quite often you'll get those that are self-selecting, as somebody else said. You'll get those that are, you know, sort of traditionally the heritage engagers and so on and so forth, but it's the marginalised groups, the less well-off, that tend to not come forward so often. So a lot of effort is required to bring that about, but a lot of the projects were interested in that. There's a project on the Muslim community too, and they said that even within their community, the older generations can be interested in, are more interested in that sort of topic, but the younger generations were continually hard to engage. A lot of effort required to convince them.
one of the elements, again, was about that the cultural diversity right under our noses that that we're perhaps not paying attention to because we're so busy trying to engage with someone so far other to us. The conversation about culturally diverse audiences started another conversation that we'll probably come back to later on, which is around are we working on an assumption that communities must be interested by us because they aren't already, or that they aren't capable until we turn up? Are we working on a kind of deficit model here that if we rock up, they can't possibly do it without us? So we started a conversation then about how we are talking to people already and how we're engaging with people and maybe who are the gateways for that. So that probably will come up again.
And again, just the idea that so much of these experiences in the war are not known about, and we've got a responsibility to make this available. We talked a bit about how the war is slipping out of living memory, and we've got a responsibility to capture a lot of this information before it's only available through secondary sources.
We also got onto the idea of memorialisation, and we tend to think of memorialisation being your war memorials, your church memorials, but that there's lots of different communities that have different ways of commemorating and memorialisation. And looking back on who is allowed to commemorate, in what way and where, and the lack of commemoration, obviously, and the lack of any kind of memorialisation. And we were talking about the needs to address that with our Somali colleagues here, and that thus being a kind of motivation for these projects.
We had an interesting discussion. This is probably one of our liveliest questions. And we started out with lots of people talking about it being sort of standard practice, that they would try and make their activities meaningful and resonate with all different sections of the community. So that was sort of standard practice. But then we went to a recognition that society at the time of the World War I was not nearly as diverse as the one we live in now. And sometimes that sort of produces some challenges around meeting some of the requirements from the funders, which few people referred to as a bit of a tick box exercise, that there are lots of different communities that need to be considered and included in the dissemination or the public activities that report on projects, and a whole sort of discussion around sometimes the projects people were working on wouldn't be relevant to some other communities. So that was interesting.
Technology was a key thing, so there's obviously the expansion in social media and the ways in which that would be used to get the messages out again to a range of possibly interested parties, whether they're community groups or again funders or partners or general society really. So I think those two things, how do you gather the information and what are the means by which you get the word out to people? Yeah.
So it's a question of who are our publishing friends, as it were, because here we all are, how do we get people to listen to us? Sometimes our voice might be loud enough alone, sometimes we need to join a choir of people to make the message stronger. So that seemed to be the story.
In some cases it was borrowing other people's resources, and we talked a little bit about for community groups where they have a partnership with a large academic institution, and that can help to sort of preserve and to disseminate some of the material. One of our groups had worked with Europeana for similar reasons, the ability to have that extended reach and those kinds of resources.
And then we've also got our hub, haven't we, that is the engagement centre hub for all 5 engagement centres, and possibly there was a discussion that possibly that could be utilised more, but then a counter argument to that was then it's almost too much. Then you'd have to have a great filtering system for anyone to look at any localities more carefully or any themes, and then that would take someone managing it. So yeah, again, it's a problem, I think, to work out how to do this efficiently.
People reported on very similar things to what you've all said in terms of using social media and the websites, and somebody else included objects that they use to create curiosity, and somebody else talked about their actual project does an installation to mark the partnership work together. People talked about reporting to communities and having information sharing sort of show and tell days. The other aspect that came up around this question was, but if you're talking about how have you reported your project's activities back to funders, there are a couple of people who were commenting on the form filling being very challenging, that if you were getting funds from other funders, you had to adapt your reports accordingly. Wouldn't it be nice if they could be standardised a bit more, save an awful lot of time? We talked really briefly about the concepts of co-production and collaborative work and how you report together on stuff. And people sort of shared a real concern about the time and energy it takes to do that, even though they might have the will to do that. That being particularly challenging to pull off.
We could sort of roughly group people into three categories. The first was people are so busy with their current projects they didn't have time to think about another one. So that was one. Another one was, yes, they have, and there were a couple of ideas emerging, one about Scotland and medicine, another was about conscientious objectors. So wonderful and clear that the current projects were leading to new ideas and new efforts. And then the third category, yes, they have ideas, but they haven't worked them up. And weren't so therefore in a position to talk about them, they felt. So yes.
We also were thinking about legacy in a more historical sense, and we haven't any plans, but there were various comments around the table as about how it would be fantastic to look at what next. 1919, 1921, the next census will come out in 2021. Wouldn't it be fantastic to have some kind of a future plan to look at that from the 1911 to the 1921 and see what the war has done to towns and cities around the country?
We also talked about the need to re-energise the stories, possibly 2016 being the moment where that will need to take place, or sort of to take a different angle on it and things like that. But an interesting project that was mentioned was of doing counterfactual histories at some point in the future, and perhaps running some kind of war game where we remove certain elements from the war. So we remove the Commonwealth from the war, then run it again through the system and see how it would have turned out differently, which is quite an interesting sort of specific project idea that could be developed in the future.
And then the discussion kind of changed through our HLF colleague as to how to encourage new projects being developed and to get those stories out, those hidden histories, or to encourage development on kind of more particular projects rather than the general. So to get people to focus.
Okay, people had lots of ideas, that wasn't a problem. Somebody was interested in prisoners of war, somebody conscientious objectors, a couple of people interested in after-war experiences like displacement, and there was somebody who was interested in, works with the VI, visually impaired organisation, and doing some parallel research with the same organisation in Germany. So lots of ideas, and I probably haven't mentioned them all, but the thing the group seemed to have in common, though, was really wanting a bit of a steer, because people around the table had lots of ideas, and it would be really handy to ask the AHRC if they could scope what's been done so far, because they wanted to know what are the holes that need plugging, or they wanted to be sure not to be duplicating. They sort of wanted a bit of a steer on, a balanced agenda about what's next, so they could, give some thought to a myriad of ideas that they have and how that's going to fit with the funding agenda. Seemed to be really important to find out sooner rather than later.
On the topic of challenges faced by projects, we could roughly group them into two categories. One was engaging people, which I think was clear it was harder than what projects or groups had possibly anticipated or would generally take for granted. And so you could the groups that they were talking about mostly were the urban poor and the rural poor. So in Scotland there was a huge interest in the urban poor, and elsewhere within the UK, in Worcestershire, there was an interest in engaging with the rural poor, and that was a huge challenge for the projects concerned. For the project that was focused on the Muslim community, it was the younger section of the Muslim community who feel that World War I wasn't something that they could own or belong to, and so it was a task getting them, but they felt that once they got them and were able to convince them, they could get them involved. So yes, the engagement of people. The other one is something extremely topical and structural, which relates to the current conditions of austerity and the challenges they impose upon institutions and the sector broadly in terms of funding and the cuts that are going on, and I think that's felt everywhere. So a big challenge for community groups and projects is being able to draw upon the right expertise and the right support that that you'd find within archives and museums and so on, and that increasingly that's less available, and increasingly perhaps that those institutions are looking at how they can make money out of those projects or activities, how they can economically benefit themselves. So that's created a problematic situation.
But I know it's very hard to get through to teachers, and Eric and Gary talking particularly about how we have Black British stories right under our noses, but our English history curriculums don't reflect those at all, and the struggle to make the case and find the gateway when we can't even get sort of slightly more privileged white women's history onto the curriculum. A point was raised about surely it's time. Well, I remember 2007, surely it was time then. I remember 2005 at the end of the war. When will it be time for us to get through the door and say there are alternative histories that are effectively mainstream, but you're just not reporting them?
We actually discussed two different types of challenge. There's the challenge of the projects themselves, the structural challenges, and then the challenges inherent in the history. So the part of the structural challenge is that community groups are not equipped to handle the legacy, and there's an awful lot of conversation going on about the legacy, the preservation and things like that, but it's an expensive and hugely involved thing to preserve legacies, and how can we do that? In some cases the things that are collected are too really insignificant to be gathered into a museum or large institution like that, but they're obviously very significant to individuals, into groups, and to people who are interested in them. So there's the challenge of making sure that those things are being preserved. There's the challenge of only being project funded. So if you're funded just to do the specific project, how can you then preserve it if all you can do is pay for the things that are inherent in doing the project itself? And if it's time bound, how can you then sort of continue that beyond that? In terms of the histories themselves, a lot of the challenge comes from the fact that some of the histories we're dealing with are quite shameful, or they're experienced as being shameful. One of our projects is the Shot at Dawn project, and there are within families, within communities, it's something that people don't like to discuss or don't want to engage with. In some cases they do, they're very keen on doing it, but in others it's still a sore wound to pick, and that carries over into a lot of the other things. We talked for quite a bit of time about the experience of German populations in Great Britain at the time and German populations now, and the way that it's seen as embarrassing by official organisations, how local authorities don't want those things to be re-examined because they're politically embarrassing or socially embarrassing. And so we've got to find ways of navigating those histories. We all agree that there's a responsibility to navigate those histories and to bring those to light, but the manner in which we do them is a challenge. And there's also the challenge in that some of the histories are very difficult to unpick because they're, the official history or the orthodox history is so dominant that finding the other histories there is challenging, and that cuts across all different types of groups. So we talked a little bit about how certain class groups are dominant in the histories. We talked about how the poetry that everybody knows of the war is of a particular class or a particular view of the war. And finding a way of gathering all that information can be a challenge because some of it simply wasn't recorded, or it's not known, or it's not available, or it's difficult to find. And so that's something that we're all trying to overcome.
Finding out what's going on and who is doing what, this kind of avoiding duplication, the idea of needing to network and needing to have access to networking and knowing what's going on in your area or your research interest. Locating resources, sometimes it's really difficult to actually locate the resources required, tracking families, that sort of thing. The idea that these projects come to an end and then suddenly what next and where do you go from there, and we were talking about how the HLF don't do pilot projects, so you really need to have a project that's got a beginning and an end, and I think some projects feel like they could have gone somewhere further with that and hadn't thought about that in the early planning stages.
We had lots of enthusiasm and created lots of interest, and now I'm left with how do I manage that expectation? And that's in the context of being really worried about where am I going to find the time and energy, to run with this. So a little bit of, am I going to run out of steam? A reminder that seed funding to explore, those little ideas of new partners and new projects. Some people were saying, you end up staying with what's safe, because I know if I run with something new and fresher, if you like, I'm going to have to put in extra time. So there's some real challenges around that.